In this video, I'm going to show you exactly how to break down the hindquarter of an elk. I'll also go into detail about each cut of meat from the hindquarter and give you some ideas on how to cook them. Plus, there is a sneaky little gland that is hidden deep within the hindquarter that you definitely want to remove. So we'll cover that and so much more. Let's dive right in. It all starts with the proper knife. I'm using a boning knife, which will make cutting into joints easier and cutting meat off the bone easier, and it really is the best type of knife for this job. I've used this cold steel boning knife for years, and it is less than $25. You can grab one in the description box below. Step one is to remove the shank. Now, the shank is the lower portion of the leg located below the knee. The easiest way to remove the shank is to cut through the joint. Now, it can be difficult to visualize where the joint is just by looking at the leg. So what I recommend is using this bend and flex method. You want to grab the leg above the knee and below the knee, and then bend and flex to see where the tissue scrunches. That'll help indicate where the soft spot of the joint is. So if you look really close in this footage, as I'm bending and flexing the leg, you can see the tiniest bit of scrunch here. And if you were to feel that spot with your fingers, you would notice it's a little bit softer there. And that's how you know you have found the joint. Now, if you start cutting through and you're hitting the bone and your knife's not going anywhere, do not fear. There's really nothing that you can mess up here. So don't be scared to back out and just try maybe a ½ inch higher or lower than where you initially started cutting until your knife starts to slide through the opening of that joint. Once you get through the joint, you want to continue your cut straight through the meat behind it. And again, I promise you can't mess anything up here. All of the meat that we're cutting through in this portion is either going to be used for grind meat or it's going to be part of the ossobuco, which some people like to keep on the bone and some people like to grind anyway. So I promise you're not going to mess this up. Just finish your cut straight through the meat. And if you're having trouble popping the joint open, especially with an elk, like the hindquarter of an elk is just huge, it can really help to use some leverage. So allow that shank to dangle off your table or your cutting board to give you some leverage and space, and then you'll be able to see where you need to cut to finish removing the shank. Step number 2, remove the femur bone. So here we're looking at the inside of the hindquarter. This ball is the hip joint and the top of the femur bone. The femur runs straight down from that hip joint to the joint we just cut through. So to remove the femur, we want to make a cut that connects that ball joint to the bottom joint. And to give you a little sneak preview, this is what the bone looks like. Just so you can visualize before you start to cut, this is the line that we're trying to follow. There is a little bit of a natural seam up near the ball joint, and that is exactly where I like to start this cut. You'll want to cut through the seam until your knife blade hits the femur bone. And you can kind of start to see it in this footage, but what I'm doing is pushing the meat away with my left hand and then cutting with my right hand. So I can now see the bone, and I'm just continuing to cut all the way down the bone to connect that top ball joint to the bottom joint. And using your left hand to create some tension on the meat really helps you get a clean cut. You want to try and angle your knife blade towards the bone and think about scraping the meat off the bone. You'll work on the left side of the bone and then work around the right side of the bone, and then you can start to lift the bone up, again, using leverage and creating some space and giving you a clear sight of where you want your next cut to be until that bone is completely freed from the meat. If you like to make stock, I'd highly recommend using a saw to cut this bone into more manageable chunks and then making some elk stock with it. The femur bone is the perfect bone for making stock. Step number 3 is to remove the top round. This big old hunk of meat right here is called the top round, and it's comprised of a couple different muscle groups. The easiest way to remove this is to grab it with your left hand and push that meat away from you. You'll start to see this white, somewhat transparent fascia in between the muscle groups, and that is exactly where you want to cut. It's this natural seam that exists, and this fascia in some circumstances is actually thin enough that you can kind of break it off with your fingertips. I mean, you just saw me do it there a second ago, which is great for us as butchers because it's giving us a natural seam, a natural line to cut. And all you have to do to remove the top round is to follow this natural seam all the way until it comes right off. Now keep in mind, each cut that we remove from the hindquarter in this first breakdown process will need further cleaning and processing. So this big old top round looks a little bit of a hot mess right now, but that's okay because we will come back to each cut and clean it up really good at the very end. Right now, we're just trying to remove each cut from the hindquarter before we process further. Step number 4, remove the gland. So now that the top round is out of the way, we have exposed a lot of yucky stuff that we need to cut away. But you need to be careful because in this area right here, there is a sneaky little gland that you may cut through on accident if you're not careful. And in case you're wondering, this is what it looks like to cut through a gland. Now, this particular example is from a white-tailed deer. So I can only imagine that the glands on this elk are at least 4 times bigger than this gland on the white-tailed deer. We're gonna start up at the top. This pipe that I'm grabbing onto is actually the femoral artery. Ew. Grab that sucker with your left hand and yank it away. We're using the leverage method again. Pull that thing away and that will help you get your knife under it and cut it away. The reason why we want to start by cutting the top of the femoral artery is because it literally gives us a handle to grab onto to keep that tension as we work our way down to the fat pocket with the gland. Be careful around the gland. If you do cut through it, the contaminants can get on your knife, and if you're unaware, you'll spread those all over the meat and it can just lead to off flavors. So be careful when you're cutting around this, and if you do happen to slice through it, no worries, just stop, wash off your knife, and then get going again. Step number 5, remove the eye of round. This beautiful piece of meat right here is called the eye of round. It is long, slender, and sort of tenderloin shaped. Some people actually refer to it as the mock tenderloin. Don't get confused, it is not as tender as the tenderloin, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later. To remove the eye of round, all you have to do is follow the seam. This is one singular muscle group, so it is really easy to see the seam and cut it off. This little bit down here is what was left over from the shank that we cut off in step 1. Go ahead and remove that and set it in your grind pile. Step number 6, remove the bottom round. This seam can be a little hard to see, so hopefully the video will help you visualize where to find it. But once you get started, there's a lot of silver skin that runs along the side of the bottom round that will help guide you. And once you get to the top, it's easiest to grab the extra pieces of meat that are covering the top of the bottom round and slide your knife under them to cut them away. The bottom round is a really odd shaped cut of meat. It's sort of a big rectangle, but up here at the top, it does get shaped a little wonky. But the good news is it is a contiguous piece of meat. It's not a bunch of different muscle groups. So as you're following the seams, it does come apart very naturally, and I mean, it's like the same thing over and over again. You just have to follow those seams to cut it away. Step number 7, remove the sirloin tip. We're left with a football-shaped cut called the sirloin tip. And this big chunk of meat that is kind of triangular shaped that wraps around the top of it is called the tri-tip. And the tri-tip is connected to another cut of meat further above that. So what we're focused on in this step is removing the tri-tip from our sirloin tip. And then there will be more stuff with the tri-tip later. But for now, you just want to cut along the seam where the sirloin tip, aka the football, meets the tri-tip, aka the triangle, we'll call it, just like I'm doing here. And then once you get to the top, I find it easiest to make a nice blunt cut, squaring off the top of your sirloin tip, and now we can set that aside. Step 8, separate the tri-tip from the sirloin butt. The last two cuts of meat to separate are the sirloin butt and the tri-tip. The tri-tip is easy to see because of its unique triangular shape, while the sirloin butt is a little bit trickier because it's made up of a few different muscle groups. Following the seam that separates the tri-tip is fairly easy to see. Once that tri-tip comes off, we are left with our sirloin butt, which I did make a little bit of an accidental slice through, and then our tri-tip, our funky looking tri-tip. And that leads us to every cut from the hindquarter before it is cleaned up a little further, which we will jump into right now. Let's start with cleaning up our beautiful top round. This thing is an absolute beast, and truly on a whitetail, I understand people keeping it whole, but you'll see as we go through this why I like to break it down, and I'll really talk through each individual step. So this first little piece that I cut off goes straight to the grind pile. It has some silver skin on it, which really doesn't matter when you're grinding meat. It's your choice if you want to leave the silver skin on or not, but I will want to trim away any fat that is on there. So I'll set that aside for the grind pile, and then we'll flip our top round over, and we need to tackle this muscle group right here. It's a very long, thin muscle group that covers the top of the top round roast. And the issue that I have with this particular muscle group is that it's very thin and it is always exposed to the air, so it dries out really easily. And if you are someone that splits the pelvis when you're gutting your deer, this muscle group is the first to get covered with contamination, with blood. So if there is any need of a reminder as to why it's not ideal to split the pelvis open when you're gutting an animal, just think of your top round. It's not just this thin muscle group that gets affected when you split the pelvis, it's also the top of the top round. So keep that in mind. But thankfully we kept this pretty clean, so all I'll need to do is trim away some of the dried meat, and then this cut will be ready for the grinder. The next muscle group is a small one located on the left side of this top round roast, and it's too small to do really anything with, and it has a pretty big piece of silver skin running through it, so this will get cleaned up and put in the grind pile as well. Now we're moving on to the real meat and potatoes of our top round roast. You'll notice that it is comprised of two main muscle groups. Some people like to keep this all together, and I think that makes sense on smaller animals, but on an elk, this is all entirely too big. It's totally unnecessary to keep it together as one, so we're going to split it apart. We'll just follow the seam with our knife until this smaller section is removed. And it's funny that I'm calling it a smaller section because really, depending on the size of your family or how you like to cook your venison, this is enough to feed at least 2 people. And if you cleaned it up, you could keep this as an individual roast. Now, all of these cuts of meat from the top round are on the more tender side of things as far as the hindquarter goes. So you could also cut this up into cubes for kebabs. If you were going to do some hot and fast cooking like kebabs or a stir fry, you would definitely want to brine or at the very minimum marinate the meat to help tenderize it a little bit further, but you can also just use it as a straight up roast. And I think it's important to mention too, if you like to eat ground meat, you can also grind this. The one thing, however, that I would not recommend doing with any cut from the hindquarter is trying to make steaks. While the top round is more tender than other cuts from the hindquarter, it is not nearly as tender as the back strap or the tenderloin. and you will be so sad if you try and eat steaks from the top round, in my opinion. I think brining some meat for kebabs is as far as you can push it, but if you do try and make steaks from a cut from the hindquarter, just remember that I warned you. Now I'll take all of those cuts of meat and clean them up. Even the ones that are in the grind pile, I will clean them up a little bit further, but I'll show you what that looks like on this main portion of the top round roast, because I think it can be a little confusing if you're new to this. Like, what do you keep? What do you cut away? And my rule of thumb is a balanced approach between trimming away the stuff that could cause some off flavors in the freezer, but not cutting away so much that you're spending an absurd amount of time trimming away every last bit of silver skin, for example, when you can just get everything to a good place. And then when it comes time to actually cook that cut of meat, you can always trim it down further at that point. But there are some things that you definitely want to trim away before getting it into the freezer. And the first thing is fat. Fat can cause some off flavors, especially if you put it away in the freezer. So you always want to make sure that you're removing the fat. I also like to spend quite a bit of time removing any of the gunky connective tissue. It can help if you use a paper towel to try and pull some of that off. And I also cut off any meat that has been dried and exposed to the air. So this cut that I'm comparing to the silver skin, you can see how the piece that I cut off was gross and dry. That has to come off. Silver skin, on the other hand, stays. Silver skin is just going to protect the meat even further from freezer burn. And then when I'm ready to cook the meat, if I decide that I want to remove the silver skin, it's so easy to do at that time. It just cuts down on my butchering time during this step to not have to cut off all the silver skin. I'd also like to mention that what you're seeing me do as a home butcher is a little bit different than what a professional butcher may choose to do. I'm not presenting this to a customer, so I don't need to square off edges if I don't want to. I don't need to trim away every last thing to make it look presentable, because it's just for me and my friends and family. Because this top round is so big, I'm going to cut it into 3 separate roasts. And for that, I'm using a larger knife. This is called a butcher knife, and it's heavier duty, and it will help me make a straighter cut than if I used the boning knife, which is a little more flimsy and flexible. Having something sturdy helps when you're making a big clean cut like this. And now these 3 roasts are ready for the freezer. Next, we will clean up the eye of round. This cut of meat is so beautiful. There is not an ounce of silver skin running through the middle of it, which makes it a phenomenal cut if you like to make jerky. It's also great for a roast. If you like ground meat, you can definitely grind this, or you could cut it into cubes for stew meat. However you decide to cook it, I would recommend a low and slow cooking method, because it is not one of the most tender cuts out there. The eye of round is probably the easiest cut to clean out of everything that you'll find in the hindquarter. I think it is my favorite cut to clean from the hindquarter, just because it is so easy. But it's very versatile, very delicious. That's your eye of round. Now let's get to cleaning up the bottom round. This cut of meat is one of the largest from the hindquarter. It is also one of the most oddly shaped cuts. So the very first thing that I do is cut off both ends. You'll notice that the ends of the bottom round are a lot thinner than the center, and that can cause uneven cooking because the thin ends will cook a lot faster than the thick center. So the first thing I do is remove these ends and set them in my grind pile. Like other cuts from the hindquarter, the bottom round is good for roasts. It can be cut into cubes for stew meat. The entire thing can be ground, or you can cut it into strips for jerky. It's the same as the eye of round in terms of its uses, because there's no silver skin running through this cut. When you look at the cross section, you can really see what a beautiful contiguous slab of meat this is. There is no silver skin in there. So if you slice really thin against the grain, you can make some beautiful jerky. And the cool thing about this is, like, you don't have to decide right this very second what you want to do with it. I have my bottom round cut into 2 roasts, and I can freeze them this way. And then when I pull them out of the freezer, freezer. If I want to use one to make jerky, I can. And if I want to use the other one for a pot roast, I can do that. Or if I decide that I want to grind it in the future, I can do that too. The last tip I have for you on the bottom round is that it is a lot easier to remove this dried outer shell when it is cut into 2 pieces. I can cut away the dry crust in one swoop, which is oh so satisfying. But basically, cleaning this cut is a little bit easier once it's in manageable chunks. Next, we'll move on to cleaning up the sirloin tip. When it comes to the sirloin tip, you really only have 2 options, in my opinion. You can keep it as a roast, which you will cook low and slow until it falls apart into tender goodness, or you can grind it. The reason why I don't see any other options with this cut is because it has a lot of silver skin running through the middle of it. So after I trim away the crusty outer shell, any gooey fascia, I like to cut it into 3 pieces. Each one of these chunks will be put into my freezer as a roast. And again, just like I mentioned with the bottom round, I can always choose to grind this up later. But here in the cross section, you can see all of that silver skin running through the middle of it. So for me, this is not a cut that I would want to cut into cubes for stew meat. It is not a cut that I would want to make slices of jerky out of. It is purely roast or grind, period. Moving on to the sirloin butt. The sirloin butt is the most tender cut of meat from the hindquarter. Part of it is literally an extension of the backstrap. So it's a wonderful cut of meat that can be easily overlooked and also accidentally missed. Like if you're not being really careful when you're pulling this meat off the pelvis, you could accidentally leave some of it behind. But if you take your time and you've got a sirloin butt, you are in for a treat. Because it's more tender, you have more options. If you take your time and remove the inner silver skin, you can slice this up into little pieces of meat for stir fry. You can cut it into cubes for kebabs. It's not really big enough for a steak, but if you wanted to make little medallions from it, you could. And for any of those hot, fast cooking methods, I would recommend brining it or marinating it at the very least to help preserve the tenderness and add some flavor. It will still make a great roast because the silver skin will break down when you cook it low and slow. You can also grind it. Lots of options with the sirloin butt. When it comes to cleaning the tri-tip, this is very easy for me. It always goes straight into my grind pile. So I cut off the usual suspects, the fat, any sticky fascia, if there's any silver skin that's easy to remove quickly. And besides that, it's going into the grinder. When it comes to cleaning the shank, you really have 2 options. You can either cut the meat off the bone and grind it, or you can use a saw and cut it into pieces for ossobuco, which is what I chose to do. You'll cook these low and slow until the meat falls off the bone. And that is it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope this video helped you butcher your elk this year. I have more butchering and cooking videos. If you're interested, feel free to check those out, but I'll see you guys in the next one.